Okay, greetings everyone, and welcome back to our Sunday school class on Reformed ethics, based on the lectures by the great Dutch Calvinist theologian Herman Bavinck. And so this is my final lesson of the series for the summer. So thank you for bearing with me all summer. We will have one more lesson in 2 weeks from now, taught by Pastor Drew. But just so you're aware, next week we're going to do a combined Sunday school class for our missions conference. So I believe we'll all be meeting in the sanctuary for that combined class next Sunday. But then we'll wrap it up with Drew's lesson the week after that, and then we'll be moving into the fall trimester. And just a heads up, I'm excited about my class for the fall, J.R.R. Tolkien. I'm going to be covering the Gospel in Middle-earth. So we'll be looking at The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and for you diehard Tolkien fans, even the Silmarillion. So that's what I got planned for the fall trimester of Sunday school. Stay tuned for more details on that. But today, as I wrap up my lessons, let me tell you where we've been and what we're doing today. We've already covered the 3 main volumes of the series of Reformed Ethics. And just to refresh your memory, if you've already been with us, or if you haven't been with us, Volume 1 is about the anthropological foundations of ethics. Human nature. What do we know about human nature in the state of creation, fall, and redemption? And how does that inform our approach to ethics? Volume 2 is about the duties of the Christian life, structured according to the 10 Commandments in particular. Then Volume 3, Bavinck never finished. He was planning to do a series of lectures on the application of Christian ethics to various spheres of life, including family and art and scholarship and church and state and so forth. He only got as far as the first sphere, though, which is marriage and family. So Volume 3 is really all about marriage and family. What the editors of the series did, though, is they supplemented the series with one additional volume called Reformed Social Ethics, which draws from Bavinck's other published works, brings them together, and fills out what Bavinck probably would have said if he'd had the opportunity to finish his lectures on the remaining spheres of Christian social ethics. So that's what we're on today. We're continuing our discussion on the spheres of Christian social ethics. So let me ask, what spheres have we already covered? Now, I did mention marriage and family. What other ones have we done already from this volume? Do you remember what I talked about last week, for example?
Art and scholarship.
We did art and scholarship last week. Very good. So that was our topic from last week. And then our topic for this week, I saved the most controversial for last for you guys. This is very much a hot potato that we're going to be discussing today, so brace yourselves. Yes, we're going to be talking about some of the debates that are happening over church and state. There is actually 2 chapters that covers this. The first chapter is on the state, and then the next chapter is actually on the church, particularly with respect to missions and evangelization. I'm not going to say as much about that chapter because I think the bulk of our discussion today is going to focus on the role of the state, particularly with regard to religion. Like, what is the proper relationship of civil government and religion? That's our key question for today, and that is an ongoing debate even within our own denomination, the PCA. You might be familiar with the fact that just this past summer, our denomination's study committee released a provisional report on the topic of Christian nationalism. And they're planning to release their final report at next year's General Assembly. There's already been a lot of debate and discussion and feedback on that provisional report, and they say that they intend to do a bit more work on the report as well, so I'll be interested to see where they take that. But that's very much a live issue within our denomination. There's a lot of connected issues to this broad topic of Christian nationalism, and some of that is going to come up today, as you'll see. So I'm going to try and follow Bavinck's structure as I address these topics by really getting, first of all, at like the basic foundations of what the state is. And Bavinck addresses this question in his writings. And I'm posing this question to you. Would the state have existed before the fall? You want to see what Bavinck says about this question? Here's a key quote from Bavinck. He says, "The most ancient form of life together in community was the family, in which civil and religious life were still intertwined and subject to the leadership of the father or patriarch, who was a prophet, priest, and king in that family setting." Now, there's quite a few quotes that the editor combines from Bavinck's various writings on this topic. And it's in some instances, it seems like Bavinck is saying, no, you would not have had state before the fall. But in other instances, it seems like he says, yes, there would have been some kind of civil government before the fall. How do we reconcile all of Bavinck's teachings? This is where, and this is a bigger debate within the Reformed tradition as well. As far as I can tell, the majority view within like classical Reformed theology is that yes, there would have been some kind of state, civil government, even before the fall. Had humanity continued to progress, as society would have differentiated, you would have had like specialization of tasks that would have led to divisions of labor, and there would have needed to be some kind of central coordinating authority to make that work. But here's a key difference that Bavinck highlights, and I think this helps us to harmonize all of Bavinck's teachings on the status of the state before the fall, the state of the state. There would not have been a coercive authority to the state before the fall. Coercion would not have been necessary because everybody would have been sinlessly cooperating with that authority. We know authority existed. Adam had an authority in the garden. And so we could presume that as society grew, there would have been some sort of centralized authority that would help coordinate people's actions. I mean, to take one hypothetical example, would unfallen humanity have eventually developed some kind of system of transportation? Probably. I mean, they were embodied creatures. You know, they had the limitations of being creatures even if they were sinless. So there's a good chance they would have developed some system of transportation. Now imagine this. How are they going to decide whether they drive on the right side of the road or the left? Neither way is sinful, right? I mean, the Brits aren't sinning, you know, in driving on the wrong side of the road. But somebody needs to make that decision, and everybody needs to agree to that decision. So you can see there would be some kind of need for a central coordinating authority, even if they don't need to bear the sword. I do think the sword is a post-fall institution. The way that the state exercises authority is different after the fall. But the idea of a central civil authority is a pretty widespread view within the Reformed tradition. Lutherans tend to disagree with that. What does this have to do with debates over Christian nationalism, you may ask? You want to guess? It also depends on how you define Christian nationalism. But generally speaking, those who advocate for some form of Christian nationalism take a more expansive view of what the responsibility of the state is, not only to restrain sin, which involves a more minimal jurisdiction for the state, but also to promote the common good, or to promote the complete good of humanity. And in that sense, you have like promotion of true religion. That's a big debated topic in this issue today. And if the state exists before the fall, it would have had a broader jurisdiction, not only in restraining sin, which did not exist before the fall, but in promoting humanity's good. So it tends to be the case, this is a generalization, that those who lean more on the Christian nationalist side believe that the state would have existed before the fall. Many of those who are most critical of Christian nationalism would say, no, the state is more of a post-fall institution. I'm painting with a very broad brush here, but do you kind of see the logic of both sides or how that argument unfolds? Bavinck, and he kind of strikes a balance here. He says, yes, there would have been a pre-fall state, but not with coercive power till after the fall. So moving forward from there, Bavinck then talks about the nature of power and how power itself, the exercise of power, is just natural to human created, our created state. How as human beings, as we grow up and mature and develop, we encounter various limitations on our own will, and therefore we feel power exerted on us in various ways. Like and you may recall that I made this infographic like a week or two ago. This was based on one of the appendices from Volume 3 of Reformed Ethics. It was my attempt to explain how Bavinck sort of orders our experience of different like constraining powers in our life. As we get older, first, we experience there's an external reality. We can't get everything we want because reality doesn't always cooperate with us. As we grow into, toddler age, we experience parental authority. And then as we move into childhood, we start to learn about rules of etiquette and fashion and style. As we start developing critical thinking skills, we start to learn that there are physical laws to the universe. You can't exactly say no to the law of gravity. And then there are ways of, like, rules of logic, for example, laws of thinking and knowing. And then at our most mature state, we come to see that there are laws of justice, but also even higher than there are moral laws. Now, how does Bavinck distinguish between the laws of justice and the laws of morality? Here's what Bavinck would say. The laws of justice only care about your external behavior. It doesn't care about your motivations as long as you're not murdering people, right? Now, you can murder people in your heart all you want, but once you act out on it, then it becomes a civil issue, right? That's when the state steps in. But morality cares about more than that. Morality cares about your internal heart attitude as well, which is why that's the highest level of moral law. Now, this is important as we think about the scope of civil authority as well. This, again, connects to debates over Christian nationalism. Because what authority can the government exercise with respect to religion, your private beliefs? So it turns out that there's a lot of misunderstanding over this question within the traditional Reformed view and then as the Reformed tradition developed over time. So we're going to come back to that point, but just keep that distinction in mind for now, the distinction between justice as external behavior and morality as like the life of the conscience, we could say. But I'm going to come back to that because I want to address what Bavinck has to say about the nature of warfare next. Just war theory. Are you guys familiar with just war theory? I'm sure. So here's what Bavinck has to say about it. The gospel, as such, completely transcends all war, desiring rather that all men and nations live together in love and peace. Okay, if we stopped right there, well then, okay, does that mean we should all be pacifists? You might think so, but here's what Bavinck goes on to say. Christ forbade his disciples to promote and defend his cause by means of the sword, since all who live by the sword will perish by the sword. Now notice, I think to paraphrase what Bavinck is saying here, he's saying that would prohibit holy war. But does it prohibit just war? Those are different questions, aren't they? Yes, we cannot advance the kingdom of Christ by the sword because the kingdom of Christ advances by word and sacrament, right? The ministry of the church. So Christ's kingdom is not of this world. All Christians, especially those in positions of authority, therefore, have a weighty responsibility and obligation to promote and preserve peace to the utmost of their ability. So, preserve peace as much as possible. Is that the same as peace at all costs? No, it's not. Bavinck has some critiques of that idea as well. The efforts to come to disarmament, to settle all differences between nations by arbitration, to prevent all wars and establish secure peace, deserve the encouragement and support of Christians. However, Bavinck does recognize that warfare may be justified as a last resort. And so this is where Bavinck aligns fully with the broader just war tradition. Now, what I'm going to share with you is a chart that I developed for my students over the years to summarize the entirety of the just war tradition on one screen. That's a lot. I know my font is kind of small, so I apologize. If that's too hard for you to read, you could follow along on your printout because I have the same thing on your printout as well. But here is my attempt to summarize, 15 centuries of Christian reflection on just war theory. More than that even. So from the time of St. Augustine in the 4th century all the way up until the 20th century, these are the principles of just war theory that have developed by not just Christian thinkers, but philosophers within the Western tradition more generally. Now, there's a lot that could be said about each of these points, but this is not my central focus for this morning. So I'm just introducing the concept to you now, so that way you have some idea of how just war theory works. There's some Latin terms I'll give you for our purposes this morning. Jus ad bellum, so I'm going with the Latin pronunciation, it's a soft J. Jus ad bellum, jus in bello, and jus post bellum. So bellum being the Latin word for war. Jus ad bellum is like the justice leading up to the war. This would be the criteria for when is going to war just. And notice that this criterion, as Christian philosophers have developed this theory, it can be distinguished between the moral criteria and the prudential criteria. There are certain criteria that must be met in order for a war to be morally permissible in the first place. If it fails these criteria, it is not a just war. On the other hand, you can still meet the bare minimum requirements and it's still not a good idea to go to war. There are additional prudential criteria that should be satisfied in order for it to be considered wise to go to war. So just because it's permissible doesn't make it wise. The moral criteria would be, is there a just cause? Is there some aggressor that deserves to be attacked on account of some fault? So that is the primary criterion. You cannot just initiate a war on your own volition without some fault. Now this, of course, does lead into big debates. If you remember the whole question over preemptive warfare with the lead up to the Iraq War in 2003. There is ongoing debate even within the just war theory over that question. But there does need to be some kind of just cause in order to justify warfare. There must also be a right intention. So you have to be aiming at the establishment of justice, a greater justice and a more peaceful society needs to be the intention, the goal. And it has to be coming from a proper authority. We as private individuals, as citizens, don't have the right to declare war on some other country. That has to come from the recognized lawful authority of of the country itself. Otherwise, we're just talking about vengeance or vigilantism or terrorism. So these were the minimal criteria that Christian thinkers put forward as necessary for a war to be just. But in addition to that, what are the prudential criteria? It needs to be a last resort. Have you exhausted all other options? And that's kind of what Bavinck was talking about too. Is there a reasonable chance of success? Or is it just going to be a losing battle? That's also another prudential criteria. And then, has there been a formal declaration of war? That would give non-combatants an opportunity to flee the area, for example. And so that's a wise step to take as well. There are also certain criteria that must be met during the course of warfare too, and that's the jus in bello. How should the combatants conduct themselves? Proportionality, so the force applied must not be greater than what is needed to render the enemy compliant. So this would prohibit so-called total warfare. I'm not going to get into historical examples because that's going to take us down a rabbit trail that will distract us from what I'm trying to get to, which is after this slide. Non-combatant immunity or discrimination. You have to make a distinction between targeting of combatants versus civilians or non-combatants, or even combatants who have surrendered. So that's a necessary element as well. Fair treatment of prisoners of war is also another necessary criterion. And then there's also a prohibition against so-called perfidy. You guys know what perfidy means? Bad faith, that's right. So it's like when a combatant pretends to be a non-combatant or pretends to surrender, only to attack nevertheless. That would be forbidden in just war theory. And in the 20th century, we now have the development of criteria for jus post bellum. What are the responsibilities of combatants after war? There are reactive criteria and then proactive criteria. So reactive would be reparation, restitution, compensation, and satisfaction. The offender would have to fulfill these requirements. Proactive would involve the reconstruction process as well. There has to be a credible plan for national restoration, elimination of undesirable influences in the previous regime, and so on and so forth. You get the idea, right? This is not intended to be my focus for the lesson this morning, but before I move forward, let me ask, do you have any questions or comments about anything on the screen here? I feel this is like a helpful guide overall to if you want to understand the basics of just war theory. Okay. That said, let's move into what Bavinck has to say in particular about church-state relations, and in particular, the state's responsibility with respect to religion. Now, in order to address that question, let me take a step back and comment on Bavinck's neo-Calvinist tradition, because I've mentioned previously in this class that Bavinck belongs to a tradition that is today known as neo-Calvinism. He's considered one of the founders, along with who else? Abraham Kuyper, that's right. And you could add a few other names too, like Guillaume Groen von Prinsterer is like a forerunner, Klaas Schilder is another name, and I could throw out a bunch of names. But Bavinck and Kuyper are the two leading thinkers within this neo-Calvinist movement. So exactly what is the neo in neo-Calvinism? They are traditional Calvinists, but they have developed Calvinist theology in particular directions. What you're going to find among neo-Calvinist theologians is this emphasis on the concept of worldview. Bavinck was one of the first Christians to use the term worldview. It actually came out of German philosophy a few decades earlier, but the neo-Calvinists recognized that because Christ is Lord over all of creation, we should submit to his lordship in everything that we do. So some of you might be familiar with Kuyper's most famous quote, there's not one square inch over all the creation over which Christ, who's sovereign over all, does not cry out, this is mine, this belongs to me. That's the notion of worldview, that Christ commands our allegiance in everything that we do, in every sphere of life. Relatedly, though, Kuyper, more than any theologian before him, emphasized the doctrine of common grace. He didn't exactly invent the doctrine. You do find it in earlier theologians. But as part of his larger social program, he was unique in incorporating this doctrine into his thinking. The idea that common grace provides us with a rationale for cooperation with non-Christians in society. That was a unique contribution of neo-Calvinism. But at the same time, that doctrine was balanced by the doctrine of the antithesis. Kuyper recognized that there is still an irreconcilable conflict between every non-Christian worldview and Christianity. So this idea of a tension or antithesis in thinking that reaches at the most foundational levels of our epistemology, our way of thinking, our way of acting in every sphere of life. That antithesis goes all the way down. In addition, the idea of the cultural mandate, it was actually a later neo-Calvinist, Klaus Schilder, who coined this term. But that refers to like Genesis 1 when God commanded Adam and Eve to have dominion over the creatures and to subdue the earth. That within Neo-Calvinist theology is known as the cultural mandate, which is a term that many of us use today. That goes back to the Neo-Calvinists. I'm going to come back to this idea later if we have time, but this distinction between the church as institute and organism, I personally think is one of the greatest contributions of Neo-Calvinist theology. And I'm going to explain why. Because I think it helps us to refine our understanding of the church's role in cultural engagement. And so understanding how the church is both of these things at the same time is really, really helpful. I think previously in this class we've also talked about the idea of sphere sovereignty, how different areas of life each have their own jurisdictions and their own scope of authority, and one sphere cannot encroach on another sphere legitimately. So that's an idea that was developed by Kuyper as well. And then lastly, this is the most disputed one for today's lesson, the idea of principled pluralism. This has probably become the majority view within like the Reformed tradition today. And I believe it's the majority view in the PCA as well, and that's also reflected on the PCA's study report on Christian nationalism as well. But the idea of principled pluralism is that Christians can engage in public life according to their worldview convictions, but so can everyone else. And the state should not privilege one worldview over another. And so the state's responsibility is to allow people the full and free exercise of their worldview convictions without privileging one religion over another. That's a controversial point. And so that's what we're going to kind of unpack in today's lesson, and that was going to be my focus. Now, you may recall Bavinck, he's from the Netherlands, and they don't use the Westminster Standards so much in the Netherlands. Do you know what their confessional documents are in the Netherlands, in the Dutch church? Three forms of unity, exactly. What are the three forms of unity? These are three confessional documents. What are they? Belgic Confession, Heidelberg Catechism, and the Canons of Dort. That's exactly right. That's right. There was a big debate in the late 1800s, early 1900s involving the revision of the Belgic Confession. In particular, Article 36, which I believe you have on your printout. This is on the duty of the civil magistrate. So this article in particular talks about the responsibility of the civil magistrate, civil government. And it talks about the responsibility that everything be conducted in good order, that God has given the sword to the civil magistrate to punish evil and to protect the good. But look at what this article said in the original wording with respect to religion. What was the government's task? Not that bottom paragraph there. The government's task is not limited to caring for and watching over the public domain, but extends also to upholding the sacred ministry, with a view to removing and destroying all idolatry and false worship of the Antichrist, and then promoting the kingdom of Jesus Christ and so forth. What do you guys think? Is that the government's job? Yeah, so it turns out this idea was pretty much just standard Reformed theology for like 200 or 300 years. It was pretty much the entire consensus of the Reformed tradition up until you start to see some debates in the late 18th century. So I'm going to get to American Presbyterianism because we ended up revising the Westminster Confession on the related article on this. But over the course of the centuries, the Reformed tradition moved in a more tolerant, softer direction than initially affirmed. Keep in mind that most of our confessional documents were written during like the height of the religious wars in Europe between Catholics and Protestants. So that line, when it talks about like destroying the false worship of the Antichrist, you want to know who they said the Antichrist was? The Pope. That is a denunciation of Roman Catholicism. They're not thinking of like pagan religions or Wicca or even Islam. They're thinking of Roman Catholicism in the original context there. Well, historically speaking, what happened in the Dutch church was in the late 1800s, they had a gathering of ministers. It's a synod. It's a church council essentially. And several of the delegates at this synod declared what they call a gravamen. In PCA language, we call it a stated difference or a disagreement with their confession. On that underlined expression, there was 8 delegates, one of whom was Herman Bavinck. Another one was Kuyper. And they said, we don't agree with that line. We love our confession, but this is the one line where we have a problem. We think it goes too far. We don't think that the government should wield the sword against people just because they don't believe the correct religion. And so this led to the appointment of a committee that met over such a period of time. And by the early 1900s, the conclusion of the committee, which the denomination itself ended up adopting, was not only to allow this so-called gravamen, this stated difference with their confession, but to just remove that line altogether from the confession. So in the Dutch Reformed Church that Bavinck and Kuyper belonged to, which actually ended up breaking away from the National Dutch Church, that's a whole other discussion, their revised confession no longer includes that line. So that gives you some of the historical background to understanding what's going on. But this very much parallels what happened within the Presbyterian tradition in the English-speaking world as well, and in the American Presbyterian context. So what I have shared with you is not something from here, this part, is not from the chapter in Bavinck. It's my supplement to show how that issue in Bavinck's day has relevance for what we're going through today as the PCA. Because the PCA subscribes to the 1788 American revision of the Westminster Confession, not the original version from 1646 that was adopted by the Westminster Assembly. The biggest, most substantial revision that the American Presbyterians made to the Westminster Confession is in chapter 23, paragraph 3, on the duty of the civil magistrate. I'm not going to read that whole thing there because that's a lot of text, but here's what I want you to do. Take a minute, just skim both of those versions. And then I want you to tell me what are the key differences that you notice between the original version of 1646 and the American revision of 1788. Yeah, if you know about the formation of the Westminster Assembly, it was a diverse group of ministers. They were not all agreed on their form of church government. Some were independents, some were Presbyterians. That was the majority view. I think there was at least one Episcopalian prelate. But let me just highlight some of the differences that we see here in these two revisions. Notice, the original English version has a much more robust place for the civil government in religious matters, right? So, according to the original wording, the civil magistrate has the right and responsibility to call synods, to reform worship, to punish all blasphemies and heresies. All that wording was taken out in the American version. What is changed in the American version? What's added? Protection of the church. It doesn't actually say like to favor one religion or another. It specifically says don't favor one denomination over another. And so there's a much greater emphasis on religious liberty in the American context. It does describe the magistrate as a nursing father, which is a term that comes from Isaiah 49:23. That's biblical language. But it's not as aggressive in the magistrate's role in promoting true religion. It's there, but on a softer level. So you can see it's a pretty big change. Yeah, John. Really? Interesting. Okay. Yeah, if you look at the history of American Presbyterians, they moved in different directions on this topic. The Reformed Presbyterians, the Scottish Covenanters, they stuck with the original wording, but the Seceders, the ARP, they changed it to their own wording, and then the mainline American Presbyterians, they came up with their own system. By the way, does anybody know who was the only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence? John Witherspoon. He was a Presbyterian minister, and he was probably one of the leading drafters of the American revision in 1788. Yeah, that's right. He was the most influential Presbyterian at that time and the most influential voice in revising the American revision. Here's an important thing to note about Witherspoon, though, why I'm bringing him up. He did not believe that the government is supposed to be neutral with respect to religion, though. He did believe that religion and morality are necessary for the well-being of a people. And so in revising it this way, he is putting a greater emphasis on religious liberty. He doesn't want non-Christians being persecuted or punished, but he does believe that Christianity provides a necessary foundation for the moral order that makes civil life possible. And that's where this debate gets complicated, because I want you to notice something that the American Presbyterians did not revise in the larger catechism. Second commandment, so no idolatry. I want you to look at the very last line of that answer, among the duties required in the second commandment. Go all the way to the bottom there. Opposing all false worship, and according to each one's place and calling, removing it, and all monuments of idolatry. Within the original American version, Presbyterians still believe that the civil magistrate has a responsibility to discourage false worship. But the move now is more so from, can I put it this way, from stick to carrot. That's one of the big changes that we see among American Presbyterians. That's a generalization. But they did not remove this part about the responsibility of removing monuments to idolatry. So, hypothetical example. Suppose there's some community and you have a group of Muslims that petitions to build a mosque within this community, and the city council meets, and they got to decide, are they going to grant approval to the construction of this mosque? I know that's not outside the possibility of, it's not outside the bounds of possibility, right? That's the sort of thing that we're dealing with in America today. What would the original American Presbyterians have said? They would have said it's the magistrate's right and responsibility to say no if it encourages false religion. As we see religious views develop within the Reformed tradition since that time, there is a greater move towards this idea of principled pluralism, though. To the point where that is probably the majority view in the PCA, although there are still divided opinions over that. And our study committee is tasked with navigating what's allowable within the bounds of the PCA. And we recognize that not every minister, not every officer agrees on this issue. So, do you say yes to the mosque or no? That's a point of disagreement that you're going to find within our denomination. Let me also add to that some other beliefs that were widely held by American Presbyterians at the time of the American Revision. Okay, so some would interpret the American Revisions as granting a more maximal religious pluralism. However, if you look at the teachings and writings of those very Presbyterians that made the revision, they still advocated blasphemy laws, for example, which were on the books in some American states up until the 20th century. They advocated Sabbath laws, that businesses needed to close on Sundays. They also, this one, it might be surprising to you, many of them advocated religious tests for public office. Now, Constitution says that's not allowed at a federal level, but many states actually had these sorts of religious tests up until the 1960s when the Supreme Court overturned that. But many of the founding Presbyterians actually defended those religious tests. So we can see that views have changed over the centuries, even since America's founding and at the time of the American Revisions, which is why this is still a point of contention within our denomination. Oh, yeah. So let me also back up and explain how the PCA system of government works. Officers, ministers are required to subscribe to the Westminster Standards. So what I showed, the American version, by the way. So the Confession, the larger catechism, shorter catechism, all officers subscribe to those. Now, we are allowed to state differences if those are approved by our presbytery. But in general, we subscribe to that. We don't have to agree with everything in our Book of Church Order. We just have to follow it. So we revise our BCO on a yearly basis. This is our governing document for how we conduct things within our denomination. So these preliminary principles, they have authority, but it's not like you lose your ordination status if you disagree with one of these principles. It's not on the level of the Westminster Standards. However, they do still have authority for us. And preliminary principle 1 in our Book of Church Order talks about liberty of conscience. So notice it begins by saying that God alone is Lord of the conscience and has left it free from the doctrines or commandments of men and so on. I'm going to jump to the end here because this is relevant to our discussion today. So our PCA's Book of Church Order says, no religious constitution should be supported by the civil power further than may be necessary for protection and security equal and common to all others. That wording actually goes all the way back to John Witherspoon. We slightly tweaked a couple words here and there, but that sentiment was originally stated by John Witherspoon. Now, I want you to look at the wording here. Does that actually forbid all religious constitutions? Keep in mind, this was at a time, like Tom said, there were many states that had established churches at the time that John Witherspoon said that line. But look at what it says. It says, no religious constitution should be supported further than may be necessary for protection and security equal and common to all others. How would a religious constitution be necessary for everyone's protection? Where does liberty of conscience come from? That idea. It comes from Christianity. Yeah. Does secularism, for example, provide a rationale for liberty of conscience? No, because it denies the metaphysical foundations for human dignity and freedom. What Witherspoon was getting at is there may be cases where a religious constitution is necessary in order to protect everyone's liberty. That's the point of a religious constitution, not to restrict people's freedom, but to secure it. Now, this is a big debated point, and like there are disagreements on how to interpret that line as well. It's not saying you have to have a religious constitution, but it's at least granting that maybe in some cases it would be necessary. If religious freedoms are under threat, maybe Christianity is the best safeguard to ensure that we hold on to those liberties. Now, as you can see, this is a controversial issue within our denomination. And my goal is not to get you to reach any particular conclusion. What I'm trying to do, though, is lay out all the various options for you. And so this, I'm going to bring it back to the Christian Nationalism study report. It lays out 3 different views, 2 of which it says they are acceptable. One would be, it is a difference, a substantial difference, but it would be up to presbyteries to determine whether or not it's allowable. Their recommendation is, now they lean towards the pluralist view, option 1 here, the committee does. They call it the general influence position, which is that Christians may and should act according to their worldview convictions in the public square and seek to influence society in the direction of a Christian worldview, but through living out their Christian worldview convictions without formally privileging one religion over another in the public square. Right. So they don't want government formally privileging one religion or another publicly, legally. That's option 1. This is the one that is the dominant view of the study committee. Option 2, I think, is probably what Witherspoon was getting at, though. They also say it's permissible, though, in the study report. The nursing father position. Remember, that's the actual language that they used in the American Revision. The state may formally promote Christianity without preferring one denomination over another, while respecting the rights of non-Christians in faith and worship. So it's not the right of the civil government to command or forbid acts of worship. It can still promote true religion without actually doing violence or persecution to those for not being Christian. That's probably what I think is what the original American Presbyterian view was. And then earlier than that, now the study report grants that this was the majority view in the Reformed tradition for like the first 200 years of the Reformed tradition, but the original establishment position would say that the state may call church councils, they can privilege a single denomination, they can suppress heresies and blasphemies. That goes a bit further than the American Presbyterians were comfortable with, which is why they made these revisions. So those are the views that you're going to find within the Reformed tradition. And the big debate, I would say, like within the PCA is between those top 2 views. There might be a small handful of people who take view 3, but that one is probably going to be more popular in like, our sister denomination, the RPCNA, or smaller denominations like that. I'm going to let you guys wrestle with that question, though, okay? Because I don't feel like I should. I'm trying to be neutral as possible in presenting the views because these are brothers in Christ that hold these views. They're officers in good standing, and I don't want to, harp on them, in a Sunday school lesson. Plus, I'm guessing that y'all within this classroom have different views on this, too. And so I do think it's important for us to recognize that we need to show charity towards one another on these different views because they are allowable within our denomination. Yes, I have my own thoughts, and you probably do see where I lean on this, but I also want to show as much charity as possible towards those who take a differing view as well. Yeah. Or like I think a good example would be like a city council debating whether or not to allow the construction of like a non-Christian house of worship, within their community. Do they have the right to say no? 1 and 2 would disagree on that. I think view 1 would say you have to allow it. It doesn't matter if you think it's a false religion because you can't show partiality to any religion, whether it's true or false. The nursing father view would say, no, there is a true religion. And so they're still free to believe their religious convictions. They can even gather together as a religious community. But in terms of construction of houses of worship, at least the early Presbyterian view would say the government should say no in a case like this. Gets in the original distinction. That's a very good question. In the original position that was held, it's one thing to gather and worship. It's another thing to construct monuments. One is a greater encroachment on the public square than the other. And so the private exercise of religion is one thing. If people want to gather privately for religious worship, that's one thing. But to construct a building is stepping into the public square.
And there's the difference between nursing.
Generally, I would say, yeah, one of the differences. And there are others as well. I think that blasphemy laws, generally speaking, would be one. Sabbath laws is another example, too. So there are some substantial differences there. Those would be some of them. All right. we're just about out of time here. There's plenty more I could say. I have more slides to go, but I feel like that was a pretty thorough treatment of the topic that Bavinck is covering. And so you have some idea of what's going on within the Reformed tradition and also what's going on in the PCA today. I was meaning to update the church on what's going on with the Christian Nationalism Study Committee. I will report back to you though once they release their final report next summer. How about that? There's a lot of brilliant minds on that report, and I hold them in high regard, and I'm looking forward to see what they're going to have in the final conclusions of their report. But that's where things stand now. At least you feel, hopefully that you feel you have a greater sense of insight into what's going on in our denomination on this very hot potato of a topic. But that said, any final questions or comments before I close us in prayer? Let me pray for us, and then we can get ready for corporate worship. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for the redemptive work of your Son, Jesus Christ. We thank you that because of his atoning work, we have a guaranteed inheritance of eternal life for those who trust in him. And so I pray, God, that we would recognize that that is the most important thing, that that our loyalty, our citizenship is ultimately in heaven, and that we can trust you to advance your kingdom. And I do pray, God, that you would give us wisdom as we seek to be faithful ambassadors of your kingdom, navigating challenges of living in an environment where people are hostile to the Christian worldview. I do pray, God, that you would give us understanding as a church to bear with one another, even in the midst of possible disagreements over certain issues that we're facing as a denomination today. But I do pray, God, that through that process that we would be edified and encouraged in knowing that we do all things for your glory. So we love you, Lord, and give you the glory. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.